throw away immediately the romantic delusion that human civilization began with an omnipotent creator snapping his fingers to bring everything into existence. That is the most spectacular scam in history. The naked truth lying beneath 6,000 years of dust in the city of Eridu is far colder and much more terrifying. When we hold the oldest clay tablet of the Sumerians in our hands, it does not tell of a beginning, it tells of an inheritance. You think the Anunnaki gods were great architects? No. Look closely at the data. They resemble administrative managers or latecomers, trying to operate a giant machine that existed long before they had names. Kingship was not created by humans or gods. It descended, as if it were a prepackaged item from another dimension dropped right down into this world. If the gods did not build the world but merely organized it, then who or what left behind that colossal legacy? If you are brave enough to look into the darkness between the cuneiform lines, where mainstream history falls silent, then welcome back. I am Zoro, the gatekeeper of buried secrets, and this is Dark History. Close your eyes. Don't worry, I'm still here. I want you to turn off the noise of the 21st century. Forget the car horns. Forget the phone notifications. Forget even the safe reality you are clinging to. We are in free fall. 6,000 years, 7,000 years, 8,000 years. Time crumbles into chalk dust. Now open your eyes. You are standing in the middle of Eridu, not the pile of rubble that modern archaeologists fence off with warning tape. I am talking about Eridu when it was still breathing. The first city, the place where the Sumerians believed the heartbeat of civilization began to beat. But there is a cruel joke here, a joke that mainstream history often ignores because it is too uncomfortable. In your hand is the Sumerian king list. It is not a fairy tale about creation. It does not start with once upon a time. It begins with a property handover record, 5 words, but enough to make any historical detective feel a chill down their spine. After kingship descended from heaven, did you hear that clearly? Descended. Kingship was not invented. It was not cobbled together by humans after thousands of years of meetings in stone caves. It was not born. It fell. Bam. Brand new in original packaging. A complete system of rule, with laws, hierarchy, and absolute power, falling into a world that was holding out its hands waiting, like an item shipped from Amazon by the gods. We often hear the lullaby stories that the Anunnaki came here, molded mud, created humans, and built civilization from zero. Dead wrong. That is the version for children. The most ancient texts, the very first lines humanity carved onto clay, do not tell of a beginning. They tell of a takeover. Look at your gods, Enki, Enlil, Inanna. We worship them as creators, but read it again carefully. In the earliest texts excavated from Nippur or Uruk, they do not act like architects. They act like middle managers who were just appointed to a company that was already running smoothly. They did not create water. They dug canals to lead the water. They did not create earth. They molded bricks from earth. They did not create the world. They arranged it. This is the first slap in the face of modern mythology. Arrangement requires something to already exist in order to be arranged. You can't clean a room if there is no room, right? The Sumerians knew this. They knew there was something before the gods had names. Before the backstabbing dramas of the Anunnaki family began, the universe was there. They called it Namu. Do not be mistaken. Namu is not a benevolent mother goddess cuddling her child. She is much more terrifying than that. In the oldest texts, Namu has no temples. No one prays to her. No one offers sacrifices to her. Why? Because you don't pray to gravity. You don't sacrifice to air. Namu is a state, a primeval ocean, pitch black and still. She does not speak, does not command, does not rule. She is pure potential. She is that which was before division. Compare the terrifying silence of Namu with the noise of her descendants later on. Enki and Enlil arguing, dividing territory, jealous, fighting for power. They have personalities. They have egos. But Namu, she is the void. And from that void, the world was not created by magic. It was labored into shape. Sumerian cosmology does not use magic wands. They use pickaxes and shovels. The world was split apart, subdivided, dammed up, embanked, and heaven was torn from Kai, earth. It was not a miracle. It was a construction project. And this is where I need you to think like a homicide detective, not a religious believer. If the gods were just the arrangers, if their job was labor and management, then who built the infrastructure that they inherited? The answer does not lie in what they say. It lies in their silence. Sumerian myths avoid speaking of the first cause. They dodge it like a criminal fleeing a crime scene. Instead, they repeat that haunting mantra, Kingship descended from heaven. Kingship was at Eridu. Descended. Fell. Take over. Modern science, ironically, is whispering the same thing as the clay tablets. Look down at your feet, beneath the sands of Eridu. Archaeologists dig deep, piercing through the 3rd millennium, the 4th, then the 5th before Christ. What do they find? They find temples, layer stacked upon layer, over a dozen levels of temples rebuilt on the exact same sacred spot, stretching all the way back to the 6th millennium BC. The city was there. The irrigation system was there. The religious structure was there. Everything was operating smoothly before the so-called kingship in the list descended. The gods did not found Eridu. They moved in. They did not invent civilization. They inherited it. Imagine you walk into an abandoned house, find dinner still hot on the table, the fireplace still burning, but no one is there. You sit down, eat that dinner, and proclaim yourself the homeowner. That is exactly what the Anunnaki did in the deepest memories of the Sumerians. But why would a great civilization claim to be an heir instead of an inventor? Why are they so strangely humble before their own history? Because there is a cut, a massive scar running across the memory of humanity, an event that wiped out the previous owners and left the house empty for the new gods to take over. That event is stuck between the world before writing and the world after. It lies in the thick layers of mud that geologists call flood deposits. As for us, we call it by a more terrifying name, the Great Flood. But before that water washed everything away, before memory was interrupted, who were those previous owners? And what did they leave behind in the shadow of Namu that even the gods dared not name? The Great Flood. When you hear that word, what do you think of? A giant wooden boat? Pairs of animals lined up neatly? An old man with a white beard saving humanity? Forget it. Throw that Hollywood image in the trash. For the Sumerians, the Great Flood was not a hypocritical moral story. It was a concrete wall slamming straight into the face of history. It was the most brutal reset button ever pressed. Before the flood, the world was something else. After the flood, memory collapsed. The survivors crawled out of the mud, looked at the colossal ruins around them, and asked themselves, what the hell happened here? And to understand what they found, we must look at the fragments remaining from the before. Welcome to the British Museum, or at least the part of it that has a soul. This is K3445, a fragment found in the library of the great Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. It is not a beer bill. It is not a love letter. It contains one of the most ancient, dangerous, and uncomfortable cosmological texts humans have ever written. It is older than the stories of Enki and Enlil by centuries, and it speaks of a world completely devoid of a creator god. Read what it does not write. There is no hand molding clay. There is no divine breath blown into anyone's nose. There is no blinding light declaring, "Let there be light." There is only Namu. Western scholars, with their obsession for seeking warmth, often translate Namu as mother. They want her to be a gentle goddess, birthing all things. Mistake. In ancient Sumerian, the word Amma means mother, true. But Namu is not a mother in the way you understand. She does not cradle, she does not nurture, she does not protect. Namu is a state. She is the pitch-black, cold, primeval water. She is pure potential, yet to be exploited. Think of her like a quantum reservoir or the deep ocean zone where light cannot touch. And this is what makes Fragment K3445 terrifying. Namu does nothing. She does not speak. She does not rule. She has no personality. She is the absolute silence before the noise of life begins. Do you know what proves this? The indifference of the Sumerians themselves. Among thousands of clay tablets spanning 2 millennia, you will find temples for Enki, for Enlil, for Inanna. You will find invoices for sacrifices of cattle, sheep, and beer for them. But Namu? Not a single temple, not a single priest, not a single prayer. Why? Because the Sumerians were ruthlessly pragmatic. They did not worship origins. They worshipped function. You don't kneel before the foundation of a house. You kneel before the one holding the house keys. Namu is the foundation. She is the necessary condition for existence to occur. And after the job is done, she disappears into the shadows. She is the absence of function. But from that silent reservoir, separation begins to occur. And this is when the architect appears, but not in the way you think. Sumerian creation is not magic, it is construction engineering. They do not speak of birth, they speak of division. From Namu, 2 principles emerge, An and Ki, heaven and earth. Pay attention to my language, principles, not gods. In the deepest layers of text, An and Kai have no faces. They have no sappy romantic stories or family arguments like in the later Greek soap operas. An is the dome, the boundary keeping the water above. Kai is the foundation, the reinforced concrete platform for everything to stand on. They are architecture. They are the structure of reality. Later, when humans started to embellish, An turned into the god Anu, the old king in the sky. Ki dissolved into other earth goddesses. But in that beginning era, they were cold and emotionless, like the laws of physics. This poses a question that keeps me awake at night. Why? Why would a primitive civilization, where humans feared thunder and darkness, visualize their first gods as such impersonal, abstract, and mechanical forces? Usually, primitive people would see faces in the clouds, hear voices in the wind. They personify everything. But the Sumerians did the opposite. They remembered a time when divinity was a system, not a person. What kind of world remembers its gods as machines operating the cosmic order? The answer lies in the concept of Dingir. The Sumerians didn't think God is in the water. They thought water is God. Enki didn't create order. Enki was just the guy hired to manage that order, just like you didn't create the internet. You just log into it. the famous Anunnaki gods we know, those full of joy, anger, love, hate, jealousy, greed, they came later. They are the heirs. They walked into a power plant that was already built, flipped the breaker, and claimed they invented electricity. But if the gods are just operators, then who is the chief engineer? Who designed that architecture of Anunnaki? Who built the irrigation systems, the cities, the concepts of kingship that Enki and Enlil merely had to bring down? Perhaps the Sumerians were right to remain silent, because the truth about the builder might be even more terrifying than the oblivion of Namu. They left clues, not in mythology, but right in the ground, in places where the gods had not yet given names. In the next part, we will dig up the thing that the myths deliberately hide, material evidence of a technology transfer that history calls gifts of the gods. Have you ever worked in a large corporation? If so, you will recognize an immutable rule. The ones cutting the ribbon are usually not the ones who poured the foundation. Welcome back. We are dissecting the greatest identity theft in human history. In the previous part, we saw the dark and silent stage of Namu. Now the lights turn on, and the actors step out. Enki, Enlil, Inanna. We call them gods. The Sumerians called them Anunnaki. But if you read their job description carefully in the ancient text named Enki and the World Order, you will see an ironic truth. They are not creators. They are HR directors. Look at Enki, the god of wisdom, of fresh water. In the legend, he travels across Mesopotamia like an inspector taking inventory of assets. What does he do? He points his finger. He sees fish swimming in the river. He calls the goddess Nanshi and says, "Hey you, from now on you are in charge of these fish." He sees grain growing. He appoints the god Enten as the agricultural supervisor. He smells the strong scent of yeast. He entrusts the goddess Ninkasi with the secret of brewing beer. Stop for a second. For Ninkasi to become the goddess of beer, beer must exist first, right? For Nanshi to rule over the fish must already be swimming. Enki did not create the chemical reaction of fermentation. He did not design the DNA of barley. He did not draw the fish fins. Those things were already there, operating smoothly. Perfect. Enki simply slapped the label "property of Anunnaki" on the things he found. This is what I call the paradox of inheritance. The gods act like squatters. They walk into a fully furnished house, divide the bedrooms among themselves, and then tell their descendants that they built the house with their own hands. So who built the house? Or rather, what built the house? Let's go back further in time, past the era of the Enki myths. Let's go to Eridu in the Ubaid period, around 5500 BC. Archaeologists dug down to the deepest soil layer of the Temple of Eridu. What did they find? An altar, a table for offerings blackened by ash. But absolutely no statues, no bearded statues, no figures holding scepters. These first Sumerians did not worship a god-man. They worshipped something more abstract, more terrifying, and perhaps more scientific. They called it Dingir. Today we translate Dingir as God, but that is a stupid simplification. In ancient thinking, Dingir was not a noun indicating a person. It was an adjective. It was a quality. Water was not ruled by an old man with a silver beard. The water itself was divine. The structure of the land, the rhythm of the seasons, the laws of the universe, they themselves were Dingir. Imagine it this way. Ancients didn't worship the god of the internet. They worshipped the network itself. They understood that the system was more important than the character. They realized there was an invisible order, cosmic order, operating this universe, a giant, sophisticated, automated machine. And they built temples not to flatter a king in the sky, but to connect with that machine. But then, degradation happened. Humans, or the Anunnaki themselves, began to anthropomorphize the machine. They turned the law of wind into the hot-tempered Mr. Enlil. They turned technical data into the wise Mr. Enki. They turned the great abstraction into petty soap operas. And the clearest evidence of this freeloading on technology is the black boxes the Sumerians called ME. In mythology, the ME are data chips containing civilization. How to write? It's in the ME. How to forge metal? It's in the ME. How to organize kingship? It's in the ME. The gods passed these boxes around. Inanna even got Enki drunk to steal them. But ask the question of a 5-year-old. Who programmed the ME? If Enki has to keep them, it means he didn't create them. He is just the librarian. The entire Sumerian civilization, from astonishingly precise astronomy to complex legal systems, was not developed gradually through trial and error. It appeared all at once, complete, as if someone downloaded a software package, Civilization Pro version 1.0, and installed it onto the brain of humanity. The gods lied. Or at least, they didn't tell the whole truth. They inherited a pre-configured world. They inherited the tools, the systems, and even the temples at Eridu. They were the late-arriving managers, taking over a colossal legacy from a vanished civilization, a civilization of nameless architects, people who understood Dingir as a physical principle rather than superstitious nonsense. But why did those architects disappear? Why was that previous world wiped clean, leaving only soulless shells for the Anunnaki to jump in and possess? The answer lies in the event that split history in two. The event that every culture on Earth whispers about in fear. It wasn't just water. It was a purification, an attempt to erase evidence. The Great Flood. And when the water receded, what stepped out of the mud was not a new beginning, but the greatest cover-up of all time. Water. It doesn't just wash away stains, it washes away memories. We talked about inheritance. We talked about gods who manage rather than create. But why is the truth buried? Why have we forgotten the true architects? The answer lies in the biggest scar on the body of the earth. The scar that splits time, pre-flood and post-flood. For the Sumerians, the Great Flood was not a myth told for fun. It was a border marker. On this side is the history we know. On the other side is the shadow of nameless giants. The Sumerian king list snaps in half right at this point. And here is the coldest line in that entire text. After the flood had swept over, kingship again descended from heaven. Again. Do you understand its meaning? The system crashed. The blue screen of Death of History appeared. And someone, or something, had to reinstall the operating system. Kish became the new Eridu. New kings appeared. But something had changed. The kings before the flood ruled for tens of thousands of years. Insane numbers that modern historians dismiss as fiction. But after the flood, lifespans dropped. Power diminished. We are looking at a corrupted backup copy of a perfect original file. Look at reality. The survivors of the catastrophe stepped out of caves. What did they see? They saw giant canals they didn't know how to dig. They saw temple foundations their current technology couldn't arrange. They saw an astronomical system that had already been calculated. They were like children, lost in an abandoned nuclear plant. They didn't know how to operate it. They didn't know who built it. So what did they do? They pushed buttons randomly, They mimicked the procedures without understanding the principles. And most importantly, they deified the previous owners. This is my final hypothesis. The Sumerian gods, Enki, Enlil, Anu, might not be entities living in the clouds. They are personified memories of the pre-flood civilization. The Sumerians who inherited this world did what humans always do when facing things they don't understand. They called it magic. Great irrigation systems became Enki's power. Aerodynamics and weather became Enlil's wrath. They invented gods to fill the void of ignorance. They created a mythology to explain the technological ruins they were living off of. Think about it. Kingship was not developed, it descended. Agriculture, writing, law, all were gifts. No civilization claims to be so incompetent that they deny all their own inventions, unless the truth is they really did not invent them. Are we, modern humanity, any different from them? You hold this device in your hand. You know how to swipe, how to touch. But if civilization collapsed tomorrow, and 5,000 years later your descendants dug this up, would they worship the bitten apple logo as a god of knowledge? The Sumerians were more honest than we think. They said, "We didn't make this. It fell from the sky. We are just keeping it." They were the guardians of a legacy for which they no longer remembered the access password. And Namu? She is the final faint memory of that root, of that primeval reservoir where everything began before being relabeled by the manager gods. Let's be honest with each other. If you, yes, you, just invented something great, like the iPhone or the atomic bomb or the rule of law, what would you do? You would carve your name on it. You would register the copyright. You would scream, "Look, I did that. I am a genius." That is human instinct. Our ego is bigger than the universe, after all. But our ancestors were not like that. When ancient people spoke of their greatest institutions, law, kingship, social order, they behaved like thieves who just found lost property. They were afraid. They bowed their heads and said, "No, not us. We aren't smart enough to come up with this. It appeared. It is a legacy. It fell from the sky." Why be so suspiciously humble? Were they pious? Or were they trying to hide the fact that they really didn't know where those things came from? Let me introduce you to a stubborn witness. This is the Weld-Blundell prism. The original is lying cold at Oxford. It looks like a baked clay paperweight, right? But this is the Sumerian king list, a dry administrative list written in 2000 BC. But read this first line, the line that makes historians want to bang their heads against the wall. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Descended. Namlugal. That is the word they used. Kingship. They didn't use the word invented, didn't use the word elected. They used the same verb to describe rain falling, or a god stepping down from an altar. Imagine this. One fine day, you are hoeing the earth, and boom, a crown, along with a penal code and a taxation system drops splat in front of you, intact, complete. That is not poetry. That is a confession. They are saying that kingship is not a social contract birthed by humans. It is an imported technology. But if it fell, where was it before? Did heaven keep it? Did an Amazon warehouse in the clouds keep it? The text doesn't say. It wipes the past clean. Only the appearance is recorded. And this is where the story becomes a prank by history. The text says, kingship fell to Eridu as an instant gift. But when we, curious descendants, Dig up the soil in Eridu. The earth tells a different story. This city had been inhabited since 5800 BC, more than 3,000 years before anyone knew how to hold a pen to write. Hey, Sumerian buddy, you say Kingship fell with a thud, right? Then how do you explain 3,000 years of building houses and piling earth, stacking brick upon brick here? There is no answer. The city developed slowly, painfully, generation after generation. So where does that divine descent moment fit into this muddy timeline? It's not over yet. Look at the list of Antediluvian kings, those who ruled before the flood washed everything away. First king, Ululim, reign time, 28,800 years. Next king, Alanga, 36,000 years. 28,800 years. I imagine the scene. The courtiers organizing the 20,000th birthday for King Ululim. Your Majesty, do you intend to retire? Your son has been dead of old age for 500 generations. I am still full of vigor. Absurd, right? No human lives that long. Scholars, people who always try to make everything rational, say, "Ah, Zoro, don't be stupid. Ululim is not a person. That is the name of a dynasty, a data compression." Fine. I accept that hypothesis, but it still doesn't explain the initial dark curse. Why did Kingship descend? Even if Ululim is a dynasty, the text still screams that this ruling system came from elsewhere, that humans did not invent state management. They received it. From whom? From the gods? Don't be so naive. Gods don't do administrative work. Gods don't sit counting sacks of wheat. Gods don't resolve land disputes between Mr. A and Mrs. B. Humans do that. Archaeology shows that accounting tokens, sealing stamps appeared gradually over thousands of years. It was evolution, not a miracle. So why? Why does the king list deny the blood, sweat, and tears of their own ancestors? Why describe human achievements as an intervention by aliens or divinity? The answer lies in the memory gap. Imagine a world that had built great systems, and then something hit, something shattered, something flooded, an ending so radical that the survivors, when crawling out of the mud, saw the colossal ruins of the old civilization, and they no longer understood how it was created. They inherited a running machine, but the instruction manual had been washed away by the water. And when you cannot explain the legacy you hold in your hands, the only way not to go crazy is to say, the gods brought it. What event created that collective amnesia? A catastrophe, a flood. And that is precisely where the boundary between myth and history is blurred. Water. It is the source of life, but also history's greatest eraser. The Sumerian king list, that lump of clay we just discussed, is not just a list of names. It is an obituary, and right in the middle of that obituary, there is a terrifying fracture splitting time in two. It divides history into two distinct eras, pre-flood and post-flood. Do you remember the kings who lived for 30,000 years in part 1? They were on the other side of the abyss, in the Antediluvian world. But the moment the line, "then the flood swept over," appears, a strange thing happens. The magic disappears. The kings are no longer immortal demigods. The length of their reigns falls into a free fall, from 36,000 years down to 1,200 years, then 900 years, and finally stabilizing at a very human level. 20 years, 30 years, 45 years. Welcome back to brutal reality. No more kings ruling longer than an ice age. Now they die of disease, of old age, or from being stabbed in the back just like the rest of us. The flood didn't just wash away cities. It washed away divinity. It marked the transition from myth to history, But more importantly, it marked the transition from memory to reconstruction. Let's perform a thought experiment. Suppose tomorrow a global catastrophe occurs. Every server is wiped clean. Every engineer vanishes. Only you and a group of survivors are left wandering. And then you find this, a car. You see the wheels, the engine, the drive system. But you don't have the design blueprints. You don't know who made it. You only know that if you turn the key, if you're lucky enough to find it, it runs. How will you explain it to your descendants? Oh, Dad built this? No, they know you aren't skilled enough. You will say, the gods granted us this chariot. That is exactly the situation of the Sumerians after the flood. They inherited a ruined but complex world. Massive irrigation systems were still lying there. Temple foundations still stood tall. Social stratifications still existed. But the archives were lost. The people who knew why and how had drowned in the mud. The survivors were forced to operate a machine whose principles they did not understand. And when you possess knowledge that you did not develop, you call it a gift from God. The Egyptians said Thoth granted writing. The Greeks said Prometheus stole fire and brought it back. The Chinese said the Yellow Emperor taught agriculture, and the Sumerians said kingship descended. That is not naive superstition, my friends. That is the humility of reluctant heirs. But look at the journey of kingship. It moves like an express delivery package. Before the flood, the king list names 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak. Power transferred from one city to another. As if kingship was a physical crown, whoever held it was the boss. And then, splash! The chain was broken, but when the water receded, kingship surfaced again. This time it wasn't in the flooded south anymore. It appeared in Kish, a city hundreds of miles to the north of Eridu. Reflect on this. Cities were destroyed. Humans died like flies. But the idea of kingship, it was immortal. It didn't need to be reinvented. It just lay there, waiting in the mud, waiting for some ambitious person to pick it up and put it on their head. This proves a terrifying truth. At the time the flood occurred, the system of rule was so deeply ingrained in the flesh and blood of this culture that even the apocalypse could not erase it. It had become infrastructure, an inevitability. But who built that infrastructure? The gods. That is the answer of the victors. Theology is always written by guys sitting on thrones. They need legitimacy. Why am I king? Because the gods sent this crown down via express delivery to my ancestor. Sounds much cooler than saying, because my great-grandfather beat your great-grandfather to death to seize this water well. Peel back that divine shell, and you will see a much more disturbing historical pattern. We see cities operating smoothly without founders. We see administrative systems running like clockwork without anyone claiming the patent. And we see a truth hidden right inside this very king list, a truth involving the greatest, most famous city, which is treated like a stepchild in this sacred list, the city of Uruk. Why was Uruk, a massive city with 30,000 people, the city of the legendary king Gilgamesh, excluded from the Antediluvian list? Is it because it wasn't ancient enough? Or because its kingship did not come from heaven? Hold on to your seats, because in the next part, we will expose the political nature of so-called divine origins. We will go looking for the true builders, the ones who have no names on the list. Do you know the definition of power? For some, power is something inherited. My dad was king, so I am king. Simple, clean, boring. But for others, power is something that must be seized. must be snatched, must be built with blood, sweat, and ambition. And that is exactly why the Sumerian king list, that divine text we are dissecting, contains a silence so deceitful it is deafening. Let's talk about Uruk. In the late 4th millennium BC, this was the New York of the ancient world. The largest city on the planet, 30,000 residents, temple complexes as big as stadiums. City walls that King Gilgamesh later boasted were impenetrable. Uruk was a monster of civilization. But if you open the king list and search for Uruk in the Antediluvian era, what do you see? Empty. Nothing at all. According to this list, Uruk did not exist before the flood. It only appeared after the world had been reset. That is a blatant lie. Archaeologists went to Uruk, dug down, and found 18 distinct construction layers. 18 layers. They stretch back into the distant past, long before the flood occurred. The city was there. Temples sprang up, layer stacked upon layer, without interruption. So why? Why did the Sumerian scribes, who were obsessed with antiquity, deliberately erase the name of this superpower from the Antediluvian Billionaires Club? Here is my hypothesis, and it reeks of politics. Uruk was removed because its kingship did not descend. It was not gifted by the gods via express delivery from heaven. The kings of Uruk rose up not thanks to divine bloodlines, but thanks to very human things: conquest, wealth accumulation, trade control, and most importantly, force. The king list is not a neutral history textbook. It is a political propaganda leaflet. It is telling us, those guys in Eridu rule because God wanted it so. As for those guys in Uruk, they are just usurpers. The distinction between received power, divine, and usurped power, human, is the core of this lie. Kingship descended to Eridu because the priestly class there declared it so. They ruled by inheritance. But inheritance requires something to inherit. If kingship descended from heaven, then who built the airport for it to land? Who dug the canals? Who laid the first bricks? The gods? The Anunnaki? No. The answer is not in the sky. It is in the ground, deep beneath the mud that those flashy royal names are standing on. Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar did something the king list never dared to do. He looked down beneath his feet. At Eridu, he started digging a hole. First layer, Islamic pottery. Next layer, Babylonian ruins. Deeper still, the brilliant Sumerians. Safar didn't stop. He dug through history, through memory, through myth. He reached the virgin soil at a depth of nearly 20 feet, about 6 meters. And there, right at the very bottom of time, Safar found Temple 16. Don't imagine marble columns or golden statues. It was just a small rectangular room, mud brick walls, a tiny offering table, and a niche. Date? 5800 BC. No writing, no king's name, no sign indicating which god was being worshipped. Just a sacred space erected by nameless hands. But here is the greatest plot twist of Mesopotamian archaeology. Safar noticed that right above that tiny temple was another temple. And above that was another temple, and another one. A total of 19 temple layers. Each layer was built directly on top of the previous one. The exact same orientation. The exact same sacred location. For over 3,000 years, the humans here persistently rebuilt this house over and over, as if they were protecting a secret lying deep within the earth. Reaching the top layer, we see the great temple of Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom. People say Enki founded Eridu. Dead wrong. Enki was a latecomer. Enki was a high-class tenant. When Enki's temple was built, 15 older versions were lying silently beneath his foundation. He did not create this sacred site. He inherited it from a forgotten past. The gods did not build the cities. The gods only moved in after humans had finished the interior decoration. So, what were the people who built those first 15 temples worshiping, if not Enki? Did they worship a name, or did they worship something more abstract, more primal? The answer lies in an ancient word, Dingir. And when we decode it, we will understand why Kingship needed to have its origins faked. Do you feel watched? Throughout the previous parts, we have seen that cities existed before kings, and temples existed before gods. But that leaves a terrifying void. If the temple at Eridu was built and worshipped in for 2,000 years, before the god Enki moved in, then for those 20 millennia, what were people worshipping? Were they bowing to nothingness? Or were they talking to mud brick walls? Let's go to Tel Brak in northern Mesopotamia. Here, archaeologists found the Eye Temple. They didn't find statues of an old man with white hair and beard holding a thunderbolt. They found thousands of small figurines made of gypsum. No mouths, no noses, no limbs, only eyes. Thousands of eyes wide open, staring, looking through time. What does this mean? It means that before humans personified divinity into supermen with names, genealogies, and personalities, they worshipped something much more abstract. They didn't worship a person. They worshipped a presence, a seeing, a concept. Back to the great Uruk. The Iana district was later the sanctuary of the goddess Inanna, the queen of love and war. But archaeology shows that architecture here was continuous and uninterrupted since 4,800 BC. Inanna, she only appears in texts nearly 2,000 years later. For 2 whole millennia, people offered sacrifices, slaughtered livestock, and repaired temples at that exact spot without ever mentioning Inanna's name. Why? Because the ancient language holds a clue we have overlooked. The Sumerian word for temple is E, meaning house. But the full ancient phrase is Dingir, not house of Mr. God A or Ms. God B, but house of the divine nature. Understand it simply like this. The original temple was not the mansion of a specific god. It was a power generator. It was a container for the divinity attached to that piece of land. The power lay in the place, not in the character. But then, memory faded. The original builders died. The great flood washed away the original meaning. Later generations inherited these houses, empty but full of power. They felt the sanctity, but they no longer understood its abstract origin. And humans, with their storytelling instinct, did what? They put labels on it. This house is so sacred, it must belong to Enki. This place is so holy, surely Inanna lives here. The gods, as named individuals, were the latecomers. They were the greatest heirs. They moved into houses they didn't build, ruled cities they didn't found, and accepted the worship originally intended for the very ground beneath their feet. At Tel al-Ubaid, people found temple foundations from the 5th millennium BC. Later it belonged to the goddess Ninhursag, but in the lowest layers, no symbols of her at all, only altars and traces of communal feasts. Before there was the religion of gods, there was the religion of community and the land. So, what is the answer to our first question? Why did they say kingship descended from heaven? Because that was the only way to explain a legacy they no longer remembered how to create. When you live in a city whose foundation is more ancient than your ancestors' memory, when you operate a complex administrative system that you don't know who invented, when you worship at a temple that stood there before your language was born, You cannot claim that credit. You feel small. You feel like a mere executor. You look up at the sky and say, "Thank you for the gift." Look at this. Look straight into these eyes. They are staring at you from the space of 3,300 BC. Those are eyes wide open, astonished, forever frozen in silent reverence. They belong to a temple in Mesopotamia, existing centuries before humans knew how to write the word God. We don't even know what they are looking at. What God reigned there? Or was it just an indefinite void? No name, no identity, only the silence of stone and dust. The truth is, the history you were taught about creator gods is a spectacular scam by those suffering from collective amnesia. Imagine this. You are standing in front of the Eridu Pyramid. Mythology, the flashy stories the priests tell you, says that Enki, the god of water and wisdom, personally built the city of Eridu right at the dawn of the world. Mythology says that An, the sky god, laid the first bricks for Uruk. Sounds authoritative, right? A command from high above. And boom, the city appears. Perfect. Divine. But this is where I, Zoro, have to crash this party. The reality is, that guy named Enki, he doesn't even appear in any text until around 2800 BC. Do you know what that means? It means the first temple stood there towering for 3,000 years before anyone bothered to mention Enki's name. 3,000 years, folks. That is a period longer than from the time of Julius Caesar to this very day. Mythology says the gods divided the cities right at creation. But the ground, the witness that does not lie, laughs in the face of those legends. Archaeology shows that these cities did not appear after a Thanos snap. They developed organically, slowly, painfully, like a boil or an ancient tree, depending on how you view it. So why? Why, when writing appeared, did the scribes rush to attribute all credit to the gods? The answer is so simple it's brutal. They forgot. When the first literate people picked up their pens, the ones who actually laid the first brick had been dead for thousands of years. The memory of them had dissolved into dust. No meeting minutes, no construction logs. Faced with a colossal legacy they couldn't explain, the scribes did what every culture does when terrified of the past. They deified it. They made up stories about kings descending from the sky because they couldn't remember the name of the first farmer who picked up a club and declared himself king. It is much safer to say, this social order is ordained by God, rather than admitting, my ancestor stole it from your ancestor. If you don't believe me, look down at your feet. Look at the physical structure of Mesopotamian temples. Mythology describes a perfect blueprint from heaven, but archaeology reveals a mess of trial and error. At Eridu, beneath the great temple dedicated to Enki, archaeologists found not one but 18 foundation layers. 18 stages. Imagine building a house, then it collapses, you build on top of it, then repair it again, expand it again, 18 times. The first temples? Tiny. Just a simple room with an altar. Over generations they swelled, added courtyards, added storage. There are layers showing they experimented with new architectural styles, then saw, this isn't right, and tore it down. There are layers full of mud, traces of repairs after floods. This is not the hand of God. This is the calloused, scratched hand of humanity. This is the rhythm of survival. They built. They failed. They repaired. There is no miracle here. Only the stubborn patience of humanity in the face of harsh nature. But the story doesn't stop there. There is a detail even more interesting. A scar in history that the gods don't want you to notice. Let's go to Uruk around 3200 BC, the late Uruk period. Suddenly, as if someone injected steroids into the veins of this city, a construction frenzy exploded. The White Temple rose upon a giant platform challenging the high heavens. The Iana precinct was completely replanned. Millions of mud bricks were moved by a massive labor force. This scale suggests a terrifying centralized power, some dictator who appeared and forced everyone to serve his ambition. But here is the real, dark history part. This grandiose phase lasted exactly 200 years. Then it snuffed out. The giant projects stopped. No more crazy constructions. Uruk was still inhabited, but that fire was extinguished, as if the city tried to reach too far, tried to do something beyond human endurance, and then the system collapsed, or was forced to stop. Mythology? Oh, of course, mythology doesn't tell of this failure. Mythology says Uruk was always great, always favored by the gods. But the ground tells a story of rise and fall, of the tides of ambition and exhaustion. Cities do not march in a straight line to heaven. They fluctuate. They inhale ambition and exhale collapse. This is a characteristic of humans, not of immortal gods. So, what is the first lesson in this case file? The gods entered history not to create the world, but to explain it after everything was already done. They are the excuse to legitimize power. They cover up the true origin full of blood and sweat of civilization. Because if you admit that your sacred temple is just the result of being patched up 18 times by nameless workers, if you admit your king is just the descendant of a magnate who knew how to mobilize manpower, then your power becomes fragile. It becomes too human. But if the gods didn't build these cities, then who did? Who organized thousands of people to dig canals hundreds of miles long before writing existed? Who convinced the crowd to sacrifice personal interests for a great common goal that they would never live long enough to see the results of? The answer lies in a strange hymn about a pickaxe and bloody canals. But that is the story for the next part. Look closely at this thing. This is the clay tablet coded YBC 7164 lying cold in the Babylonian collection at Yale University. For dreamers, this is a sacred hymn. But for me, and for those who dare to look straight at the truth, this is the sketchiest alibi in history. It tells the story of creation. But forget the open sesame incantations or the finger snap creating the universe. This text is far more ruthless and realistic. It says that the god Enlil created the world not with magic, but with a pickaxe. Wait, a pickaxe? Why would an omnipotent god need a manual labor tool to construct the world? Let's peel back their language. In Sumerian, this pickaxe is called al, a precise technical term used for a specialized hoe for irrigation. The act of breaking the ground is bur, the verb used for digging canals. And here is the part that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The hymn describes humanity sprouting from the earth after that pickaxe strike. The word used is yu, exactly the word used to describe crops coming up after sowing seeds. Do you see the problem? This is not a flowery metaphor for the birth of humans. This is an agricultural report. In the eyes of the gods, or more accurately the ruling elite of that time, you and I are not miraculous beings. We are crops. We are the product of a high-tech farming process. We were planted to be harvested. They didn't create humans to love. They created humans to labor. If you think being considered crops is bad, wait until you hear the story of Enki and Ninmah. Mythology says the gods were tired. They were sick of digging canals and building dams themselves. They wanted to go on strike. So they created humans to shoulder that hard labor for them. But the way they created us is what's worth mentioning. In the Bible, God breathes life into clay. It sounds romantic and personal. But in Sumer, no kiss of life whatsoever. The first human was created in a dub. Do you know what a dub is? It is a brick mold. The same vocabulary, the same process recorded in warehouse management texts. Take clay, stuff into mold, dry in sun, and you have a brick. Take clay, stuff into divine mold, and you have a human. The message here is as cold as cash. Humans are not unique works of art. We are mass-produced labor units. We are identical, easily replaceable, and the sole purpose of existence is to be plastered into the wall of civilization. Zoro tips his hat to this brutal honesty. At least they didn't lie that they loved us. Now, open the Eridu Genesis. Instead of describing supernatural miracles, this text is overflowing with construction verbs. Dig foundation, raise platform, build embankment, establish irrigation canal. The god Enki doesn't use a magic wand to conjure a city. He builds it. He uses the very words a foreman would scream at slaves on a construction site. Why? Why elevate the work of shoveling dirt into a divine act? Because, my friends, that labor process was too great, too terrible, and too persistent for the next generation to believe that mortal humans did it. Look at southern Mesopotamia. This is not the Garden of Eden. This is a death trap. The land is flat, saline, scorched by 50 degrees Celsius heat in the summer, and drowned by insane floods in the spring when snow melts from the Zagros Mountains. To survive here, you don't just adapt. You have to declare war on nature. You have to dig canals 9 meters, 30 feet wide to lead river water in, but be skillful enough so the water doesn't wash away homes. You have to build drainage systems to wash away salt, otherwise the land dies after a few crops. And you have to do it continuously, forever, generation after generation, because silt will clog the flow the moment you slack off. And here is the knockout punch to the myths. All of this massive system existed more than 1,000 years before writing. The Ubaid period, 6,500 to 4,000 BC. No kings yet, no texts yet, no names of any specific gods carved on stone yet. But satellite imagery and soil analysis show a network of canals stretching hundreds of miles was operating perfectly. Distribution canals radiated like capillaries, pumping life into the dead desert. Who did that? Who convinced individual villages to stop fighting to dig a common canal? Who drew up the plan that needed 50 years to complete when the average lifespan was only 30? Who organized humanity from wandering tribes into a giant geoengineering machine? We don't have their names. No monuments for these first grand engineers. When writing appeared, the memory of them had faded, and the scribes, the latecomers, looked at that magnificent canal system and exclaimed, "This must be God's work. Humans can't be this good." Enki dug canals. Enlil built embankments. Divinity is just a flashy cover thrown over the extraordinary effort of nameless humans who terraformed an entire geography. But to do that, to turn free farmers into bricks in a framework, you need something stronger than religion. You need control. You need a ruthless bureaucracy that can turn humans into numbers. And that, my friend, is when the real nightmare begins. Before we talk about pyramids or skyscraper temples, I want to tell you the most bizarre story in Sumerian mythology. The story is titled, "The Debate Between Grain and Sheep." Sounds like a fable for children, right? But listen closely to this passage. The text describes the era before humans were created, when the Anunnaki gods still ruled the earth. It says, "They knew not the eating of bread, knew not the wearing of garments. They roamed the earth and grazed on grass-like animals. Stop for a moment. The gods grazed on grass. Our great gods crawled on all fours and ate grass in the fields. Is this a divine insult? No, this is a memory. That strange passage is the black box recording the truth about prehistory. It is recalling the era before organized agriculture appeared, the era when humans, or the ancestors of these gods, lived as hunter-gatherers, wandering, free, no kings, no temples, and most importantly, no one ordering them what to do. And then, the change struck. Mythology calls it the creation of humanity. But under the microscope of Zoro here, that is not creation. That is restructuring. That is the moment independent farmers were stripped of their freedom to become a centralized labor force. That is when society split into two types of people, the one holding the whip and the one holding the hoe. The sprouting of humanity that we talked about in the previous part, that is the birth of the ancient proletariat. We were not born from divine will. We were born from the needs of a new economic machine. How do you control thousands of people? How do you force them to work their tails off all day instead of lying under the shade of a tree? Do you use force? Too expensive. You use writing. We often romanticize writing as the source of literature, of poetry. Dead wrong. In the Uruk period, 4,200 to 3,100 BC, when writing appeared, it was not used to write love letters. It was used to count cylinder seals, clay tokens, stone tablets recording data. All are tools of accountants. This is the technology of bureaucracy. They recorded every jar of beer, every loaf of bread distributed to workers. This is evidence of ration control. You work, I record your name, I distribute bread. You don't work, you starve. Real power in Mesopotamia did not lie in the hands of warriors holding spears. It lay in the hands of bald scribes sitting in warehouses, holding a clay tablet and deciding who got to eat and who got left to starve. These cold rationalists turned humans into numbers in ledger books. Do you still think I am exaggerating about this misery? Let the numbers speak. Mathematics doesn't know how to lie. Look at the White Temple at Uruk. It was built around 3,200 BC. Just the foundation of this temple alone, not counting the architectural structure on top, was a monster that swallowed human strength. Engineering estimates show it required about 15 million mud bricks. 15 million bricks, each one weighing about 13.6 kilograms, 30 pounds. Visualize the process. Dig clay. Mix with straw and water. Mold by hand, one by one. Dry under the scorching sun. Carry it on your back, walking to the construction site. Place it in the exact position. If an extremely strong and hard-working laborer could make and transport 100 bricks per day, a very optimistic number, then this foundation alone consumed 150,000 man-days. That is equivalent to one man working continuously without rest for 410 years. Or, more realistically, thousands of people working relentlessly for years under the supervision of whips and attendance tablets. And this is just one building, in one city, at one point in time. Multiply it, dozens of cities, hundreds of temples, thousands of miles of canals crisscrossing southern Mesopotamia. The total amount of labor poured into this land is an unimaginable figure. It far exceeds the capacity of volunteerism or simple faith. You don't build these things just because you love the god Enki. You build them because you are part of a giant machine that you cannot escape. Mythology says, the gods built the great Uruk. The truth says, the blood, sweat, and bones of millions of nameless people are compressed tight beneath the feet of those temples. When we look at these majestic ruins, We often marvel at civilization. But Zoro sees a crime scene, a crime of labor exploitation on the largest scale in human history, cleverly camouflaged under the flashy cover of religion and divinity. But the final question remains, if it was all just ruthless exploitation, why did this system last so long? Why didn't humans rebel and destroy it all? Or did they already do that? Recall the construction frenzy in Uruk that I told you about. Millions of bricks, skyscraper temples, an explosion of energy that seemed endless. But then, it snuffed out. About 200 years. That was all the time this grandiose phase lasted. After that, the cranes, if they had them, came down. The brick kilns went cold. Uruk still lived, but that insane ambition to touch the stars died. Why? Mythology never tells you about failure. Mythology says Uruk was great forever, but the ground, our honest friend, tells a different story. Cities do not rise in a straight line. They fluctuate. They rise like the tide and recede when drained. Perhaps the land was exhausted. Perhaps the slaves had endured enough and let go. Or perhaps the bureaucratic system collapsed under its own weight. This is the naked truth. Civilization is not an eternal miracle. It is a struggle between human ambition and the limits of nature. And sometimes, nature wins. So when things became chaotic, when the initial explosion passed and society needed to stabilize, what did the elite do? They invited the gods onto the stage. Think carefully. If I am king and I say, "You must listen to me because I am stronger, I am richer, and my grandfather beat your grandfather," then sooner or later, you will pick up a brick and throw it at my head. My power is accidental, usurped, suspicious. But if I say, "Hey, it's not that I want to be king. It is the god Enlil who chose me. My position is cosmic order. To resist me is to resist the universe." Aha, a completely different story. The gods entered history to legitimize injustice. They explained why some families got to sit in the cool shade eating from golden bowls, while others had to wade through mud. They turned historical accidents into divine destiny. It is much safer to blame, or attribute credit to, the high heavens. But today, right here, I want to return justice to the true owners of this land. Not Enki, not Enlil, not Gilgamesh, but the people who dug canals when no one knew how to write. The people who molded 15 million bricks when no one knew of the wheel. The people who turned deadly swamps into the granary that fed humanity. They have no names in the king list. They have no hymns. Their bones have dissolved into the very mud bricks they created. The great systems, canals, seasonal calendars, astronomy, all appeared before the named gods. Humans did it all themselves. We saved ourselves, organized ourselves, and built this world ourselves through painful trial and error, through blood and tears, not through magic. Have you ever asked yourself why life is so exhausting? Why Monday mornings exist? Why we are born to go to work, pay bills, and then go to work again? Many people will tell you that is the trial of life. Or more romantically, labor is glory. Dead wrong. The reason you have to grind your face off every day is not because the universe wants to temper your soul. The reason is very simple. You were designed to do that. Literally. Welcome to the uncensored version of human history, where our presence on this earth is, in reality, just the result of a high-level HR crisis. Forget the image of gods sitting on clouds playing harps. According to the Sumerian epic Atrahasis, the early gods lived no differently than seasonal construction workers. They had to dig canals, dredge rivers, build levees. Imagine you are an immortal entity, infinite power, able to fly among the stars. But your boss, the god Enlil, forces you down into the ditch to scoop mud for 2,500 years. What would you do? Of course, you would rebel. And that is exactly what happened. The lower-ranking gods, called Igigi, organized the first strike in the history of the universe. They didn't just hang slogans. They burned their pickaxes and shovels. They surrounded Enlil's office at midnight and screamed, "We quit! Dig it yourself!" The situation was very tense. Enlil panicked. Without anyone doing irrigation, what would they eat? But that bunch of gods refused to hold a shovel anymore. So what was the Galaxy Board of Directors' solution? Raise wages? Reduce working hours? No. They did what any ruthless corporation would do. Outsource. They needed a cheap labor force, one that didn't know how to complain and was easily replaceable. And boom, welcome the birth of humanity. Stop hallucinating. We are not works of art or images of God in the romantic way later religions embroidered. We are scabs, strike breakers. We are biological machines created to shoulder the KPI that the gods were sick of. This is not a story about creation. This is a story about HR management. Before, gods worked, shared communally. After, gods act as management. Humans act as staff. Creation was actually the moment this slavery contract was formalized. The gods were promoted to the elite, and we accepted the position of permanent unpaid interns. And if you think I'm making this up for fun, look at the financial reports of that time. Economic text from 2900 BC. They do not record poetry. They record ration distribution lists. Hey, Mr. A, digger, today gets 2 bowls of barley. Ms. B, weaver, gets 1 jar of oil. They were not called free citizens. They were classified by function of use: bricklayer, shepherd, digger. They were assets of the temple, which was actually a state corporation. Work and you eat. Don't work and you starve. A social welfare system so wonderful that you didn't have the right to refuse. But here is the interesting plot twist. This perfect system of exploitation appeared in history way too completely. As soon as humans knew how to write, everything was operating smoothly as if it had been running for 1,000 years. Just like when you buy a new computer and find Windows already pre-installed, along with dozens of pieces of bloatware you never asked for. Who installed this system? History books say the gods, but archaeology whispers a different truth into our ears. Actually, this system was built by humans themselves, but the initial builders, they vanished. They left no business cards, no check-in selfies, no memorial steles. They only left collapse horizons. Around 3,900 BC, everything was peaceful. Then, boom. The old order collapsed. Urban centers were abandoned. Pottery shattered. And covering all that mess was what? Mud. Lots of mud. Floods. Not a global deluge drowning the whole world like a Hollywood movie, but regional server resets. Floods came, wiped clean every record, washed away every memory. When the water receded, the survivors looked around, bewildered. Who dug this canal? Who built this temple? Because they didn't remember who did it, since the ledgers drifted away. They did the only thing they could do to explain the existence of that massive infrastructure. Must be the gods who did it. How could normal people do this? And thus, from a historical data loss incident, we have mythology. But what event pressed the delete button on the memory of an entire civilization? The answer lies under 3 meters of clay at a royal cemetery, where a British guy thought he had found the Bible. 1929, Leonard Woolley. Remember this name? He was a typical British archaeologist, patient, meticulous, and desperate to find something to grab headlines in the London papers. He was digging at Ur, one of the most ancient cities in the world. His team had dug through royal tombs glittering with gold and silver, through layers of broken pottery, through the waste of thousands of years of living. And then, clank, they hit bottom. No more artifacts, no more bones, no more trash. Only mud. A layer of pure silt clay, up to 11 feet thick. That is more than 3 meters. Woolley was confused. He thought he had hit a riverbed or a primeval seabed. But instinct told him to keep digging. And guess what? Beneath that 3-meter layer of mud, civilization appeared again. Pottery surfaced again. Traces of human life appeared again, but with a completely distinct style compared to the layer above. Woolley was stunned. A thick layer of mud sandwiched between 2 historical periods. He immediately ran to the telegraph station and sent a shocking message back to London. We have found the flood. Bravo, Leonard. He believed he had found archaeological evidence for the biblical Great Flood, the event where Noah built an ark to save the world. The press went wild. Religious believers applauded thunderously. But I have sad news for Leonard, and for you as well. He was dead wrong, but in some ironic way. He was also right. Woolley was wrong because he thought it was a global flood. A single game-over event wiping out everything at once. But Earth does not operate according to a Hollywood script. Look at the data. The mud layer at Ur dates to 3800 BC, but at the city of Uruk not far away, the flood layer appears in 3500 BC. At Shurapak, 2900 BC. At Kish, 3100 BC. Do you see the problem? This is not a single doomsday. This is a chain of serial disasters. A TV series of destruction lasting a whole millennium. Floods in Mesopotamia were not an event. They were a feature, not a bug. They happened periodically, locally, but every time they swept through, they were as devastating as an atomic bomb dropped on a specific city. And this is when things get interesting and terrifying. When the water rises, it doesn't just kill people or collapse mud brick houses. It does something more terrible. It wipes the memory clean. Imagine your company is storing all critical data on soft clay hard drives. And then, water floods in. The entire HR file, payroll list, technical drawings, names of architects, reasons why we built this temple here, all dissolve into mushy mud. The only thing left when the water recedes is the shell, the bare architectural structures, the great canals, the temple foundations. But the guts, meaning the memory of who built it and how, have drowned. Let me prove this fracture to you. Look at the Sumerian king list, their most important, and also craziest historical text. The first part of the list lists 8 kings ruling before the flood. Their reign times, 18,000 years, 28,000 years, 36,000 years. Unless they drank an immortality smoothie every morning, this is clearly the time of myth, a golden age that no one remembers clearly, so they just inflated it to sound impressive. Then the text records a cold sentence. Then the flood swept over. And what happens next? Kingship again descended from heaven. But this time, it didn't return to the old cities. It moved to Kish. The new kings had more normal, more human lifespans. The continuity was broken. It's like when your computer crashes. You are forced to press reset. When the machine reboots, the operating system is still there, but the data in the RAM is gone. Mesopotamian civilization had to reboot. But what did they reboot from? Put yourself in the shoes of the survivors. You return to your hometown after the disaster. Your parents are dead. The old priests, the keepers of knowledge, are dead. The clay libraries have dissolved. But you see the giant canals still lying there. You see the foundations of the great temples still standing firm. You have to repair them. You build on top of the old foundations. At Eridu, at Uruk, archaeology shows post-flood temples were built stacked tightly upon pre-flood temples. The same orientation, the same location. But why? You ask the person next to you, why do we have to build the temple in this exact spot? Why does this canal flow in that direction? And the scariest answer is, I don't know. Probably the gods arranged it beforehand. This is the key. Floods did not create civilization. Floods deified the ruins of civilization. When you inherit a massive infrastructure system that you don't know who built, you won't dare claim you did it. You will say it is a gift from God. When memory is erased, that void will be filled with myth. The nameless builders were forgotten, to make room for stories of powerful gods descending to earth. And precisely at this moment of collective social amnesia, a new group of managers stepped onto the stage. Those who claimed to be the legitimate heirs of the old order. They were not the creators, they were the latecomers. They were the Anunnaki. Anunnaki. What does this name conjure in your head? Ancient aliens coming from planet Nibiru to mine gold? Genetic engineers who bred humans in a space lab? Please. If you want to hear those sci-fi stories, change the channel to History Channel at midnight. Here we talk based on evidence. And the truth about the Anunnaki in the original texts is far more naked and mundane than you think. They were not cosmic architects. They were more like middle managers. Look at the HR files of these gods. The word Anunnaki, meaning princely offspring, first appears where? Not in majestic creation hymns. They appear in invoices, exactly. In administrative documents from the early dynastic period, around 2700 BC. This is a list of offerings, ration allocations, inventory of temple warehouses. The Anunnaki entered history not as creators of resources, but as receivers of resources. They arrived after the cities were built, after the irrigation system was operating, after the bureaucracy was running smoothly. Do you know what this looks like? It looks like when a startup has finished building everything, the product has launched successfully. Then suddenly a brand new board of directors parachutes in from out of nowhere, sits in the director's chair, and declares, all of this is managed by us. The Anunnaki are the greatest Nepo babies in history. Consider the organizational structure of this Divinity Incarnate Corporation. The ancient text titled, The Duties and Powers of the Gods, is actually just a dry job description. Enki, Director of Freshwater and R&D, Research and Development. Enlil, Director of Agriculture and Meteorology, Wind and Crops. Ninhursag, Head of Obstetrics and Health. Utu, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court cum Solar Energy Supervisor. Nana, Head of Human Resources Administration, in charge of timekeeping, moon and time. Each god was assigned a portfolio. But pay close attention. These portfolios existed before they took the job. Water flowed, the sun rose, rice grew, women gave birth. They did not create physical laws. They were merely appointed to manage them. This is bureaucratic delegation, not cosmic miracles. Let's take the myth Enki and the World Order as an example. Enki travels across Sumer. He goes to cities, points fingers, and assigns functions to them. He goes to rivers and orders how they must flow. He regulates productivity for the fields. Sounds powerful, right? But read it again carefully. When this text was written, those cities had existed for 1,000 years. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers had flowed in those channels for ages. Meluhha, ancient India region, had traded timber with Mesopotamia for a long time. Enki didn't conjure them. He was going on an inspection. He went around, looked at what was operating, and stamped it. This is mine. That operates according to my law. He formalized what was already available. That is the language of royal decrees, of state administrative regulations, not the proclamation of a creator. And here is my favorite story. The story that strips bare the nature of the technology transfer of the gods. Inanna and Enki. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, or as I call her, drama queen, visits Enki at the city of Eridu. She gets the old man drunk as a skunk, and in his drunkenness, Enki signed the decision to transfer the so-called me. What are me? They are the source codes of civilization. Kingship, priesthood, metallurgy, writing, music, art. Inanna loaded this whole pile of me onto a boat and bolted straight back to her city of Uruk before Enki sobered up. What do you see here? This is not creation. This is stealing trade secrets. This is a hostile takeover of intellectual property. Civilizational institutions, the me, were considered tangible objects that could be packaged and transported from an old city, Eridu, to a new city, Uruk. Inanna did not invent writing or blacksmithing. She imported them. She redistributed power from the old center to the new center. This reinforces a terrifying truth we spoke of in the previous part. The Anunnaki gods are heirs. They inherited a world that was ancient even to them. They arrived to manage systems they did not build. They ruled over humans they did not truly love. Remember, they once wanted to destroy us with a flood because we were too noisy. So the biggest question still remains, hovering like a ghost over the Mesopotamian sky. If the Anunnaki are just late-arriving managers, then who are the true architects? Who are the people who built the foundation of this world before the flood wiped their names clean, leaving the latecomers to casually claim the credit? We modern humans are perhaps also stuck in the same trap as the ancient Sumerians, believing in myths written by the winners and forgetting the true builders. We have come a long way, from the strike of the gods to the layers of mud wiping memories clean and the appearance of the Anunnaki managers. Now, let's piece all those puzzle pieces together. The final picture that emerges is not a heroic epic. It is an indictment, and the defendant is our own naivety. Recall the story of Inanna stealing the me from Enki that I told in the previous part. What did she bring back to Uruk? Kingship, priesthood, blacksmithing, writing, construction techniques. Scholars call it civilization. I call it an operating system. Inanna did not bring back miracles. She brought back social management software, a set of rules to turn a chaotic crowd into an efficient labor force. And who installed that software? The Anunnaki. Who is the hardware running that software? It is us. Look out the window. We are still living in that system, right now. We wake up according to a schedule managed by the god Nana. We work to maintain agriculture and industry in Lil's domain. We obey laws of Utu. We drink water from the irrigation system of Enki. The names of the gods have changed. We call them government, corporation, market. But the nature of the relationship remains unchanged. A class managing resources and a working class maintaining the system. The hierarchy that the Sumerians described as established for eternity after humanity was created. It is still here. It never left. The Anunnaki may have disappeared from the records or retreated into the shadows, but the bureaucracy they, or their predecessors, left behind, it is a perpetual machine. It operates itself even when there is no driver. And here's the darkest truth. The flood didn't just erase the past, it established a terrifying precedent. Oblivion is part of the process. Every time a civilization collapses, whether by water, by war, or by economic collapse, the survivors suffer from collective amnesia. We forget who built this world. We forget that it was human hands, our ancestors, who dug those canals, who baked those bricks. Instead, we look up to the sky and seek answers from supernatural forces. We attribute the credit for our labor to the gods. We turn ourselves into tenants in the very house we built. Myth is not history. Myth is a sedative. It helps disaster survivors explain the fracture of the world without going mad. Why are we suffering like this? Because the gods will it so. Why must we obey the king? Because kingship descended from heaven. It legitimizes injustice. It turns labor management into divine order. But archaeological evidence, sterile layers of mud, dry administrative texts, sudden changes in architecture, they are whispering a different story. A story of people who built, who collapsed, who forgot, and who were forced to serve a system they no longer fully understood. So, what is the lesson here? Don't wait for the Anunnaki to return. Don't wait for a messiah to step out of a flying saucer to liberate you from your 8-hour workday. They are not your parents. They are the old managers of this building. And us, we are heirs suffering from amnesia. We inherited the rivers, the cities, and even the burdens of the past. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The floods will come again. Maybe water, maybe fire, maybe digital. If you are watching this far-expecting billion-dollar flying saucers, hybrid giants, or the planet Nibiru crashing into Earth, then I apologize. You are on the wrong channel. Please turn off this video and go back to Hollywood's sci-fi dreams. But if you want the truth, a truth that is naked, colder, and more ruthless than any sci-fi movie script, then stay. You think the gods created humans? Let me show you how humans created the gods to legitimize their own seats of power. Imagine you are standing in the middle of Uruk in 3000 BC, dusty, noisy, the smell of sweat and livestock heavy in the air. This is not the Garden of Eden. This is ancient New York, and like any metropolis, it craves power. The mythological texts we find are not improvised poems. They are political manifestos. Uruk and Eridu, the two super cities of that time, were not just competing in trade. They were fighting for legitimacy. When the priests in Uruk claimed their city had a culture superior to Eridu, they didn't use an army to prove it. They used mythology. They told stories that they had absorbed sacred knowledge from Eridu. Sound familiar? It's like a tech corporation today acquiring a rival and claiming the patent always belonged to them. The gods, in this context, are not impartial, omnipotent beings. They are representatives, chess pieces on the chessboard of the cities. The rivalry between the gods is a perfect reflection of the power struggle between city-states. And the Anunnaki? Who are they in this play? Forget the image of glowing, omnipotent creatures. Look at them as a board of directors, a collective born to stamp approved for whoever holds power. Look at the language. Words don't lie, only people translate them wrong. What does the name Anunnaki really mean? Don't listen to conspiracy theorists on the internet. Look at the etymology. It stems from An, the sky god, and Unnak, meaning royal or noble offspring. Put it together. What do we have? Children of heaven, not creators, not genetic engineers, but a divine aristocracy. They are the rich kids of the universe, the heirs of power, not the creators of it. Texts from the Third period, around 2100 BC, describe this with brutal clarity. The Anunnaki are portrayed as a council gathering to pass judgment. They issue decrees. They decide the fate of kings. But pay attention to this detail, because this is the deadly part. This council has no fixed headquarters. When the city of dominated Mesopotamia, guess where the gods met? At When Babylon rose and crushed the Anunnaki packed their bags and moved their meeting to Babylon. Do you see the problem? The gods do not create the center of power. They follow power, like politicians swaying with the wind. They are there to nod and say, yes, the one holding the strongest army is the one we have chosen. They don't create kings. They are just the red stamp to validate the throne. But this reflection goes even deeper. It goes into the very skeletal structure of society. The Anunnaki are not a happy brotherhood of equals. Oh no, it is a multinational corporation with an extremely strict organizational chart. At the top are the great Anunnaki, 7 most powerful gods. They are the board of directors, the ones who make strategic decisions, the ones holding controlling shares. And below them, hundreds of lesser gods, also known as the Igigi. What is their mission? Guarding gates, counting inventory, supervising ditches, managing irrigation schedules. Does that sound like the job of a god? Or does it sound like the job description of a construction foreman? This divine system appeared in texts at the exact moment Mesopotamian society became extremely stratified between rich and poor. When kings began to beat their chests, claiming absolute power. When temples turned into giant landlords, controlling thousands of slaves and workers. When a farmer realized that no matter how hard he worked, his son would still be a farmer, and the priest's son would be a priest again. The hereditary class froze society. The gods did not create that hierarchy. They reflected it. The Sumerians looked at their own unjust society and projected it onto the sky. They created a heaven just as bureaucratic, just as class-divided, and just as ruthless as the earth. And here, my friends, is the most important clue. A detail often overlooked, but containing the darkest secret. The Anunnaki have no creation myth. Ransack every library, every broken shard. The texts never explain where the Anunnaki came from. No one says how they were born. No one says who gave them power. They simply appear. Boom. They are there. Already organized. Already assigned roles. Already ruling a universe that was running smoothly before they set foot in it. Even An, the old father of the gods, is not the creator in the literal sense. He is just the chairman of the board. He rules from a distant office in the sky. As for how this world was formed, the Sumerians attribute it to vague forces, Namu, the primeval waters, the separation of heaven and earth, natural processes occurring before the named gods jumped into the fray. The Anunnaki inherited their positions exactly the way Sumerian kings inherited the throne from their fathers. No one asks why the king is king. He is king because he inherited it. The Anunnaki are gods because they inherited the universe. But the question is, from whom did they inherit it? If the gods are merely managers, supervisors of canals they did not hand dig, ruling cities where they did not lay the first brick, then who built those things? Mythology is silent, a deafening silence. Because answering that question honestly would collapse the entire power foundation of the ancient world. It would force them to admit a terrifying truth, that this order is not eternal, that before the gods, there was something else. And to cover up that truth, they created a perfect legitimization system. But why did they have to do that? What was the real motive behind this divine play? And what does it have to do with a grain tax invoice of a farmer 4,500 years ago? Stay right there, because when we come back, we will step into the mind of the greatest con artist in history, the priests of Uruk. Let's play a role-playing game. You are a priest in Uruk around 2500 BC. You wear a fine linen robe, your belly slightly protruding because you are well fed. What is your job? Managing temple lands, collecting taxes, and distributing rations to the starving crowd out there. But you have a problem, a very big problem. Why must the farmer submit half the grain he harvested to you? Why must the builder listen to your orders instead of going home to sleep? Why does this social order from which you benefit exist? You can't always use the whip. Whips are expensive. You need something cheaper but 1,000 times more effective. You need an explanation. And so you write mythology. You pick up a stylus over a wet clay tablet and begin to tell a story. You describe Enki, the god of wisdom and water, dividing the world. What does Enki do? He assigns roles to lesser gods. This one watches the warehouse, that one watches the river, the other watches the livestock. Sound familiar? That is exactly what you do every morning at the temple. You assign tasks to scribes, overseers, and slaves. You describe the Anunnaki meeting in council to issue decrees. That is exactly how your city council meets to resolve land disputes. The divine realm becomes a mirror image of the institutional realm. This is the most spectacular scam. You create a world of gods identical to your bureaucratic machine, then point to the sky and tell the people, look, as below, so above. This order is natural. It is the will of the universe, immutable. The gods do not explain the social order. They justify it. They are the eternal warranty stamp for your power. But if you are a skeptic like me, you will realize a fatal flaw in this logic, a question that myths never dare to answer. If the gods only appear to formalize existing systems, then what created those systems before the gods arrived? If the Anunnaki are managers of canals they didn't dig, rulers of cities they didn't found, then who built the things they inherited? The answer is a taboo truth. Humans. It was humans, not gods, who created civilization. But admitting this is suicide. Because if humans created the system, then humans can change the system. If power is a product of history and chance, not an eternal command from above, then the king's throne and the priest's chair can be toppled at any moment. That is why myths keep absolute silence regarding origins. They begin with inheritance. They describe God walking into a fully furnished office. They hide the carpenters who built the desk, the masons who built the wall. They erase the true author to honor the manager. So what happened to those true creators? Why did we forget them? Human memory is a terribly fragile archive. Imagine a world without writing. Knowledge exists only in the heads of elders. Then disaster strikes, war, famine, and especially floods. Just 3 interrupted generations, and an entire technical tradition vanishes. How to build a specific kiln? Lost. How to navigate by stars? Forgotten. How to negotiate water sharing between 2 villages? Gone. Everything can be wiped out in less than a century. But humans need structure to survive. When technical details, the how, are lost, humans cling to the story, the why. Anthropologists have seen this happen over and over. The first ancestor who dug the canal has had his name forgotten, but the principle that water must be shared according to ritual remains. Mythology is what remains when the event collapses, but the structure is still needed. And this is where the truth about Enki is laid bare most nakedly. The myth of Enki organizing the world is not flighty imagination. It is a memory map. The domain of each god in the story corresponds exactly to a real economic sector of Sumer. Every divine assignment reflects the administrative units that already existed. The story preserves the system even when the origin of the system has been forgotten. It is like you forgetting who wrote the Constitution, but you still memorize the laws because they were set to the music of a hymn. And when we talk about survival, things get even more dramatic. You think the sacred marriage ritual between the king and the goddess is just erotic superstition? Mistake. That is the highest political theory. But to understand that, we must dive into something scarier than politics. Catastrophe. How do you teach your descendants to survive the apocalypse when you are no longer there? Sex and violence. The two best sellers of all time, from Hollywood to Mesopotamia, and the Sumerians, masters of PR, knew how to use them to rule you. Let's talk about the sacred marriage. Sounds romantic, right? Every year the king and the high priestess, representing the goddess Inanna, would perform a ritual of uniting bodies. Many look at that and see a fertility ritual, praying for a bountiful harvest. But what do I see? I see a political contract sealed with sweat. This is not primitive superstition. This is encoded high political theory. Look closely at its mechanism. The king needs divine approval to sit securely on the throne, but that approval is only demonstrated through ritual. And who performs the ritual? The priest. Conclusion. The king cannot rule without the temple, and the temple cannot have actual power without the king's protection. Mythology encoded this vital dependence. The gods became the common language for political and religious institutions to shake hands, share power, and control the crowd. It is a symbiotic relationship that existed in reality long before it was written as a fairy tale. But the gods didn't just protect the king's chair. They did something much more important. They helped humans avoid extinction. We all know the story of the Great Flood. Gods get angry, water rises, a hero builds a boat and saves humanity. Don't bother with whether God was truly angry or not. Look at what this story teaches you. Build sturdy boats, stockpile grain and seeds, respect the destructive power of water. Never build houses in low-lying areas. When you see water rising abnormally, run immediately. This is not a moral lesson. This is a survival manual. The Sumerians lived between two aggressive rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. Floods were daily bread, but human memory is short-term. After 100 years, no one remembers the details of the disaster in 3800 BC. After 200 years, the fear of the flood in 2900 BC has faded. How to warn great-grandchildren about this deadly danger when their grandparents are all dead. You package that knowledge into a dramatic story. You add divine fear to it. The gods sent the flood. This sentence is much easier to remember than hydrological data shows the flood cycle is once every 50 years. Mythology replaces witnesses with supernatural commands. Survival knowledge is preserved intact, even when its original reason has been forgotten. And this is where things get ironically interesting. Have you ever asked yourself why the gods proliferated after writing began to appear, not before? Writing came too late. When the first stylus touched clay, Sumerian civilization had already existed for millennia. The systems were too old. The origins were lost in the fog of time. The scribes, our first screenwriters, faced an impossible task. They had to explain a finished world, but they had no history books to reference. What did they do? They invented divine authors. Who came up with this complex canal system? No one remembers that engineer's name. Fine, call it a gift from Enki. Who drafted these legal rules? Don't remember. Okay, it is the decree of Utu, god of justice. Who found this herbal remedy? No clue. So attribute it to Ninisina, the goddess of healing. The gods became containers. They contained all the knowledge, techniques, and rules that the culture possessed, but for which it no longer remembered the creator. The gods did not create knowledge. They were the mechanism for ownerless knowledge to continue operating. Imagine a disaster wipes out our civilization today. Global blackout, internet down, libraries burned. 3 generations later, our descendants see ruined skyscrapers, giant dams that have stopped working. They don't know who built them. They don't know what reinforced concrete is, but they need to maintain them to survive. What will they do? They will create myths. The god of electricity granted light. The god of water built this dam, and we must offer sacrifices to them so the dam doesn't break. That is exactly what happened in Mesopotamia. Divine mythology stabilizes society after catastrophe. When floods disrupt cities, when populations must evacuate, when the continuity of a dynasty is broken. Mythology is the only thread connecting survivors to the lost golden past. You might not remember who built the temple, but you remember it belongs to Inanna. You might not understand why canals must be dredged this month, but you remember Enki ordered it so. Mythology preserves function when origin has become inaccessible. And this leads us to a spine-chilling realization, a truth that could completely change how we view human history. If the gods are just curators keeping human memory, then the real world before that, the world that built all these wonders and then vanished, how great was it? The Anunnaki are not aliens coming to enlighten us. They are the shadows of our own ancestors, the giants who have been forgotten. Prepare yourself, because in the final part, we will peel back the last layer. We will look straight into the days of old and face the fragility of the very civilization we are living in. There is a phrase that haunts me. It appears repeatedly in Sumerian texts, so much so that archaeologists often skim over it as a cliché. In cuneiform, it is written as Ud-Ullah. Translated, it means, the days of old. It appears in temple dedications, in royal steles, in the prologues of myths. It is like a ghostly whisper. What you see here is not new. It is inherited. It is remembered. The Sumerians were obsessed with antiquity. They never beat their chests claiming to be great inventors. On the contrary, they believed they were merely trying to patch together something greater that had been broken. Look at the evidence. It converges like an arrow pointing straight at the past. The Sumerian king list does not start at 0. It opens with the sentence, "After kingship descended," meaning it came from somewhere else or another time. It places divine rule in a continuing sequence of events, not a starting point. The cold truth is this. The Sumerians believed they were survivors of an apocalypse. They did not believe they were the first civilization. They believed they were latecomers. Imagine this scenario, a scenario that doesn't need aliens. A world developed brilliantly over thousands of years. Engineers designed complex irrigation systems. Astronomers mapped the stars. Architects knew how to lift giant stones. All of this happened before writing existed. And then, boom, catastrophe. Floods. Maybe multiple floods lasting over centuries. Populations wiped out. Continuity severed. The holders of technical knowledge all died. When the water receded, the survivors walked out of stone caves. What did they see? They saw giant canals they didn't know how to dig. They saw majestic temple foundations they didn't know how to build. They saw a complex agricultural infrastructure waiting to be operated. They inherited a giant machine where the instruction manual was lost. What did they have to do? They had to operate it to live, but they couldn't explain it. Therefore, they created the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki are not guests from Nibiru. They are metaphors for the achievements of ancient humans, so ancient that even the Sumerians forgot who they were. That is why the Anunnaki always appear as managers instead of creators. That is why they only organize the world instead of creating it from void. The first texts of humanity, those dry clay tablets, are actually property inventories of a dead civilization. Writing was born not to write poetry. It was born to manage the remaining remnants of the prehistoric world. Myths are not fiction. They are funerals. They are verbal monuments to a lost world. They are a desperate attempt to freeze knowledge into an eternal form, religion, so it won't be forgotten again. And here is the final question for you. Sitting in front of a screen with modern technology in hand, if our world collapsed tomorrow, if the internet went dark, satellites fell, and coastal cities were submerged, 1,000 years later, what will survivors say about us? Will they remember Steve Jobs, Albert Einstein, or the engineers who built the Three Gorges Dam? Or will they look at our concrete skyscraper ruins and weave stories about giant gods? Will they call us Anunnaki, those with the power to change the climate, fly in the sky, and communicate through black mirrors, phone screens? The Sumerian texts do not reveal an alien plot. They reveal something much deeper and more painful: the fragility of human memory. Beneath the clay tablets, beneath the divine names, are the echoes of real people. They built, they fought, they dreamed, and then they disappeared. What remains is not them, just their echo carried by myths. The gods remember what humans have forgotten. And today, through this video, we have remembered them together, not as strange cosmic creatures, but as our lost brothers in the river of history. I am Zoro, and this is Dark History. Question everything, even what you have just heard.